Shalom from Tel Aviv, and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. I am Josh Leifer, filling in for your regular host, Allison Kaplan-Summer. Our guest today, who we are incredibly excited about, is David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker, which is arguably the most important weekly magazine in the Anglophone world. David is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and someone who's reported deeply on Russian politics, America, culture, music, sports, and, of course, Israel-Palestine for more than 30 years. David, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us today.
It's an honor to be here. I listen to the podcast and read the paper. I hesitate to use the word religiously, but every day.
I think that would qualify as religious, but I'm no rabbi.
I've even written about Haaretz, as some of you may know. So I wrote a long piece about Haaretz for the New Yorker during the Obama administration, and somehow that piece, which clearly the subtext of which is this is an endangered liberal institution in a political world that's moving to the right, interested Obama so much that 2 days after it came out, I got an invitation to come see him at the White House. That's how much he was interested in Haaretz. Yeah. And as you can see, it changed the world so radically.
Well, we appreciate it. You wrote another piece about Haaretz during the war, also about
I did. Not that you're fishing for compliments, but what Haaretz has done in the face of so much media reluctance and cowardice and avoidance is to cover every difficult subject in front of it in a way that so few have, so you have my admiration.
Thank you. No, that means a great deal to all of us here at Haaretz. You were actually just here. You reported a profile of Gadi Eisenkot, former IDF chief, who's, for now at least, Netanyahu's leading rival, and you frame him as the anti-Bibi, more in style than substance. That point is underscored by the interviews that closed the piece with Yehuda Shaul and Isamro, who are both friends of the podcast. I'm going to ask you to speculate here, especially since by my count, you've sat down with every Israeli prime minister since 1996. Not that there have been that many. But having met the man, do you think that he has what it takes?
Can I indemnify myself in advance here? I don't know who's going to win. I know, the New Yorker committing to a large profile of an Israeli politician is no small thing, but anything could happen. What do you have left 70 odd days before the election? And I looked at Haaretz, and already things are tightening in some of the polls. So knowing Netanyahu as we do, both as a campaigner and the duplicity that can come with those campaigns and how successful those duplicities have been in the past, anything could happen. And Eisenkot, has strengths. Part of it is a personal connection because of his own story, the loss of his son and two nephews in the war, which contrasts so vividly with Netanyahu's rather steely indifference toward, on a personal level, toward the same kind of thing. The one thing that people all seem to know in Israel about Gadi Eisenkot is that his politics are, I think, by design, less distinct. I think we both can agree that he's very deliberately avoiding the subjects that many people would want to hear the most, from particularly abroad, about the Palestinian question. But he's the anti-Bibi in the sense of he comes across as honest, he comes across as warm. He doesn't feel like, for better or for worse, somebody who's mastered Machiavellian politics. He's a military man, and he's the architect of the Dahia doctrine, as I think most of your listeners know what that is, which is the determination to use enormous force against places that attack Israel. Dahia being the neighborhood of Beirut, where Hezbollah has operated from. So this is not someone who comes to the campaign with peacenik credentials, but rather the opposite. So a lot of it is people wanting to vote against Bibi, being sick of Bibi, who find him dishonest or duplicitous, or feel that he was principally responsible for the greatest collapse of the state since its inception, meaning October 7th. So it's a complicated picture, and it's certainly not a complete one, as every Israeli knows.
We're speaking here during a relative lull in what has been nearly 3 years of catastrophic war. And yet, Gaza remains in ruins. More than half, roughly, is still occupied by Israel's army. In the West Bank, settler violence continues to spiral out of control. You made 5 reporting trips to Israel in the almost 3 years since October 7th. What brought you back each time?
I've been the editor of the magazine for a very long time, since 1998. And so my opportunities to report are pretty limited. My job is to run the magazine, which has its complexities. And just like Aluf Ben writes columns every once in a while, I take the time to report. And the 2 places that I know, at least to a degree, I don't want to be vain about it by any stretch of the imagination, have been Russia and Israel-Palestine. And Russia, I feel, is closed to me for the time being. I'm friends with people who have gone to jail since then. And so I'm very hesitant to go to Russia. I think that's a very dicey thing for reporters in general, and for me along with them. So I've come to the Middle East, and obviously I come from a particular background. I'm a Jew, an American Jew, who's made his first trip there at a very young and tender age. And since being a reporter, I've come periodically, but I've never been there for, a full stretch, as reporters do for 3, 4, 5 years. I've never done that. So I approach it I hope, with some sense of my own limitations and humility. I don't speak Hebrew or Arabic. I have a real attachment to, and read constantly about, and listen constantly to things coming out of there, and know a lot of people. And so I hope to add to what we publish about it over time.
How did your understanding of the war, and in some sense what has happened to Israel, change over the course of those trips since October 7th?
Where do I begin? I'd been to Gaza as a reporter, as well as the West Bank and all over Israel. And to come to Israel a few days after October 7th, and to go to the kibbutzim and the towns around, in the Gaza envelope, and not be affected would be just impossible. So on the first trip, what happened is I made a beeline for Be'eri and Kfar Aza and places like that. And the stink of death was still very much there, and things were in ashes. And the sense of grief and also the failure of the state was profound. I remember very immediately talking with Ilana Dayan, for example, of Channel 12 from Uvda, whom all your listeners know, said what I then heard all the time was that the state had failed, and the promise of the state, the promise to so many of what Zionism meant, which is the protection of the Jewish people after centuries of, to put it mildly, vulnerability and attack and finally the Holocaust. That contract had failed to such a degree that people were in a state of not just grief and rage, but also it had an effect in the most profound way on their inner selves. This was very, very evident. And at the same time, very immediately, there was the intimation about how Israel would react to this. And I know that Joe Biden has got a lot of criticism for his behavior over his period of time in office in the aftermath of this, and not least in our pages, in a long piece by David Kirkpatrick a few weeks ago, about how ineptly or weakly the Biden administration reacted toward Netanyahu, how it essentially got rolled. But Biden said something very important and prescient in that trip to Israel. He said, "We stand by you." And Biden had this kind of very old-fashioned and one should understand diminishing sense of solidarity with Israel. He said, "But don't make the same mistake that we made, which was to act out of uncontrolled rage following September 11th. He was obviously referring to Afghanistan and very in particular Iraq. But this is precisely what Israel did. And initially in its rhetoric in the cabinet, but then in its military behavior and this policy of, what's the phrase of Netanyahu's, complete war, total war.
Victory.
The results of which we see, which is at least 70,000 dead Palestinians and 20,000 children, the infrastructure and housing stock of Gaza decimated, extraordinary suffering, and then the political repercussions in the West, the political repercussions in Israel. One could go on, and you know it all too well. And Netanyahu behaved, at least in my view, and I think certainly to the view of many writers at your paper, precisely in the way Biden had counseled him not to, and others had counseled him not to. And what good did it do?
Yeah, I hope we will get to talk a little bit more about the political ramifications, because I know that's something that our readers are very interested in hearing, how to understand what's happening.
If that first piece had a theme, it was, in addition to trying to portray the emotional, political, and military situation on the ground, limited by the fact that, as you recall, reporters like me and you were not allowed to go into Gaza, except in the most limited way with the IDF. It was that the need to hold more than one thing in your mind at once. And we've seen this now for 3 years. In other words, in certain areas that are obvious, the only thing to say is to rage about October 7th, and understandably. And then in other quarters, the only thing to rage about is the behavior of Netanyahu, as if the answer to all questions is Bibi Netanyahu. Well, on the anti-Semitism question, if you look at the world in a particular way, every criticism of Israeli policy is rooted in anti-Semitism, or every critique of Israeli history and its origins is anti-Semitism. And yet at the same time, anti-Semitism exists in the most powerful and growing way. And so the ability for people to, and you experience this at your own drama, to have any kind of complex conversation is often impossible. And just to raise the notion of complexity is to somehow betray the situation from one point of view or another.
You have a beautiful line at the beginning of that piece when you say that the only way to tell this story is to try to tell it truthfully and to know that you will fail.
Over and over again. I know a fair number of people in the Israeli press that are not in Haaretz. And some of this is changing, particularly in the West Bank, not as much in Gaza. But the failure to face what was happening in Gaza squarely and visually was terrible.
You'd mentioned your extensive reporting in Gaza and the West Bank, and I wanted to ask you, you met with quite a few Hamas officials, many of whom, were very frank about their intentions. You have a line, this was the most arresting aspect of the Hamas leaders. Their thinking, their charter, their goals, short range and long, was unconcealed and calmly provided. But then by the late 2010s, it seemed to many, certainly to Benjamin Netanyahu and his advisors, that Hamas, and especially after it took over Gaza, had become preoccupied with governance. Some said, Hamas was pragmatic. There was talk that Hamas, after it revised the charter, would be open to a Palestinian state on 67 lines, although I think that in retrospect that seems much more equivocal than it was.
I would bow to experts on this, but I think that was a statement of convenience. I don't think Hamas ever really gave up the texture behind that initial charter. Whether it's its is Islamism or it's anti-Semitism or not. I think it was about the shift in their rhetoric was about as sincere as Netanyahu's speech at the Bar-Ilan.
That's a good way of putting it.
You'll remember Bar-Ilan at Bar-Ilan under great pressure from the Obama administration. Netanyahu got up and said, there could be two states under these certain conditions, and this was seen as a great breakthrough in Netanyahu's thinking. I think that was bullshit from top to bottom. And so much so that when Netanyahu finished that speech, he came off the stage and not long after met with a very high-ranking American diplomat and said, "Okay, now I've said it. Okay, can we move on?" In other words, it was a situational moment of convenience, and nobody was to mistake Netanyahu for having changed his mind any more than Hamas changed its mind. The great mistake in a political military sense was that Netanyahu came to see Hamas as a third-order threat incapable of threatening Israel. And basically, as I think mutual friend Amos Harel says, that they came to see Hamas as nothing more than a bunch of gangsters with AK-47s, and the real threat was from Hezbollah in the north and Iran above all, and other proxies, that Hamas was under control, and that very cynically it could be fed cash thanks to the good offices of Qatar, even though they knew that some of this cash, or a lot of that cash, was going toward the construction of the tunnel network and acquisition of arms, that it was under control through electronic surveillance and other wizardry. And this turned out to be a terrible illusion.
Yeah, I think we all have a lot of us have a memory of Netanyahu unveiling what was the, I think in English its translation is the below ground barrier, that they had installed this high-tech fence that went deep into the ground.
Which was then defeated by the very high-tech method of bulldozers, motorcycles, pickup trucks, and the rest. Look, Amos Harel's book on this is, and his reporting on Haaretz is second to none on that collapse. It was psychological, it was cynical, and it was a kind of misdirection play. And we now know from documents that have been collected and other reporting that at a certain point, Sinwar, with encouragement from Iran, began thinking about this kind of attack, although the attack itself, the date of it was certainly a surprise to Iran and Hezbollah. And I think what we know is that on the morning of October 7th, there was a communication from Sinwar to his allies in Tehran and Beirut to please join, basically apologizing for the surprise, sorry for the rude surprise, but please join in immediately. And Iran did not, and Hezbollah did so initially in the most symbolic way, to kind of show the flag, but not to really open a northern front in any serious way. And to bring the conversation back to Eisenkot, there was a strong desire, particularly in the defense establishment, to open that second front within days of October 7th. And Eisenkot had been brought in to this war cabinet along with Benny Gantz. And Eisenkot was the sort of leading voice pushing against that. And that finally prevailed. And obviously Biden was against that too.
I think in Israeli public collective memory, let's say, there is this lingering fear, this sense that had Hezbollah been more closely in on Sinwar's plan or responded quickly, it very well could have conquered parts of northern Israel and the Galilee.
The obvious parallel is 1973, both in terms of strategic surprise and unprecedented threat. That was a two-front attack from Syria and Egypt. And for a matter of, 2 or 3 days, there was real concern that attack could not just be in the Golan Heights and Sinai, but that would penetrate, as it were, the Israeli interior. And a two-front immediate attack would have been a hell of a lot more problematic. The one thing I don't want to skip over here is the question of what Gadi Eisenkot, were he to prevail, were he to lead a coalition, an opposition coalition, and win 61 votes, what he would change and what he would not. I think that is at the center of what I was trying to pursue. And at the same time, parallel to that, what would be the ramifications if Bibi were to prevail again. That seems to me the center.
We could start with Eisenkot because, I went and looked through his party's platform. It actually talks about pursuing peace and securing a Jewish demographic majority, which to my ears is the other way of saying some form of two-state agreement. There's no other way of doing that. Obviously, he's not going to talk about that now. But, he also won't be able to do that if the junior coalition partner is Naftali Bennett and the fourth coalition partner is Avigdor Lieberman. And then when I turn it over on the other side, and then I think, okay, well, Gadi Eisenkot is not going to be as good at playing America in the world as Netanyahu. And he also has, different first principles. So, I don't know.
I got a very good critical note from somebody that I talk to from time to time, Hussein Agha, who was a Lebanese-born diplomat and author and bon vivant and much else. And he said one thing that, you may have missed, Remnick, is that Gadi Eisenkot is a career military guy and has little to no experience dealing with leaders in the region. Whether it's MBS or all over the region. And as he put it, they're a wily lot. But he said there is this flaw in or shortcoming in his career resume. And that's true. It's 100% true.
It could read down in different ways. I often think that an Israeli leader who is coming more out of the Ben-Gurion tradition than the Jabotinskyite tradition would look at, the offer of Saudi normalization for a pathway, not even, to a Palestinian state, and say this is beyond the wildest dreams that Israel could have ever had in 1948. Yalla, let's jump on it.
Still doesn't solve the Palestinian question. I think if you kind of break it down in rough terms, what would an Eisenkot-led government do in the relatively short term, or capable of doing, and what can it not do? The sense that I got was the following. What it's not going to pursue is an outright open two-state solution, put it this way, resolution toward the Palestinian question. What it could do is act far more forcefully and forthrightly about what's going on in the West Bank, which is so serious and so constant and so widespread that a lot of people, both in Israel and in the West Bank, think it could cause an explosion different from, but on the scale of, Gaza. And that you're playing with absolute fire in every sense, not least because you're allowing the far right, in military terms, to back up, to give support to these settlers who are committing daily acts of egregious violence and behind it the impulse of annexation. Period. That can be stopped with a real assertion of good government. Bibi still, when he gives an interview, I think he gave an interview to Time magazine at one point, ascribed these incidences as rather minor and ascribed them to, unruly
a few
teenagers.
Troubled youths.
Unbelievable lies. Not that my own president isn't given to.
Well, they're very alike in this way.
Incredibly so, and I think they've learned from each other in the worst sort of way, both in rhetoric and behavior and impulse. And so I think that could ease. I think the so-called judicial reform would be, there'd be an end to that, and separation of powers, and what questions of democracy. And I want to put a pin in that word because, look, I think in the United States, we didn't really, which strives to be a multi-ethnic democracy, did not have anything of the like until the mid-'60s. We just celebrated 250 years of the Declaration of Independence, but there was this small problem of slavery and then voting rights and civil rights that really were not made matters of law until the mid-'60s. So when I talk about democracy, I mean on very specific issues, not democracy in the largest sense, because until this question is resolved, in the same way that those questions were not resolved, although God knows we still have problems with this, to just blithely pat yourself on the back about democracy is an illusion.
Do you still think that a resolution is possible? One of the things that struck me about reading through the arc of your reporting is that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the first profile for the New Yorker you wrote from Israel was the Natan Sharansky piece?
I did. I'm 67 years old. When I came of age as a human and as a reporter, the following things were happening in the world. There was a very serious peace process. However illusory, however you want to criticize it, there was a peace process. There was a democratic wave that stretched from eastern Siberia to South America. Now I find myself with, bags under my eyes and slower to get out of a chair. And the wave is authoritarian. So I want to be both idealistic and realistic at the same time. I never think all is lost. I mean, you live in a state that rose 3 years out of the ashes, literally. I mean, a terrible use of the word, but of the Holocaust. That is an astonishing thing. And for all the arguments about 47 and 48 and what led to it and so on, but that is an astonishing thing that nobody could have reasonably expected shortly before. So I think it's humanly, historically, as foolish to be fatalist as it is to be preposterously optimistic.
I think that's very well put.
I lived in Moscow at a time with, demonstrations on the street in the hundreds of thousands in favor of democracy. And now that country is ruled by, I think authoritarian is to put it very, very mildly. But none of us live to see historical resolutions, but we live to see the next chapter if we're lucky. But there's better and there's worse. And right now, the country I'm living in has worse. We democratically elected twice the worst possible individual in terms of duplicity, corruption, authoritarian impulse and action, disregard for democratic processes and institutions, and sheer seichel, strategic. I mean, this war being prosecuted in Iran is the stupidest adventure imaginable. They woke up a few weeks after it started. They go, oh my God, there's the Straits of Hormuz. The level of blithe indifference and stupidity is astonishing.
It is.
As bad as Vietnam was, and obviously the damage of Vietnam was far worse in its sum, and I hope we never approach that with this adventure. But no one's ever going to write a book called The Best and the Brightest.
That's for sure. It's, who'd have thought that we would live through a U.S. administration that would make the George W. Bush presidency look sophisticated in its analysis? I
think the second Trump administration has revealed Trump to be, I was criticized on election night 2016. I'll make an admission to you. The New Yorker had nothing to publish the next morning.
That's incredible.
We were so cocksure that Hillary Clinton would win that I went to one of those parties you go to watch the returns come in, and we had a cover all set to go, and we had various pieces that were going to drop about the first woman president and all the rest. And I go to this party and the votes start going the way they happen, and I had had what Rush Limbaugh used to call one large adult beverage. And I don't know if that confused me or emboldened me. And I went into the kitchen with my laptop and wrote a kind of screed called An American Tragedy about Trump's victory. I've been wrong about certain things in the past, but I was right about Trump, but I could not have imagined the depths of the cynicism and the unbelievably naked greed and corruption. And I think finally that's where a greater American majority has caught on to this. A lot of people were willing to countenance a lot of things for whatever interests. A lot of people, for whatever reason, were willing to have a billionaire sort of be their voice as working class people felt they were getting left behind. However ironical and confusing it may be. But I think what they see now is somebody just stealing, just, scooping up billions of dollars for himself and his family, and being obsessively interested in the weirdest way with ballrooms and triumphal arches and gold, and completely unable to fix his concentration on minor matters of war and peace, the economy, and the rest. This is a very outraging presidency. And I think other than his MAGA base, you're now seeing that happen at long last. And that may be what Bibi is facing. Although I don't know. I picked up Haaretz this morning, and every day I look at the little bean counter telling me, and I noticed that with the exception of Channel 12, the other polls, let's take 14 and 15 out of the running here for a second. But, he's down to the Eisenkot opposition bloc is gone from 60 to 58 suddenly. I don't know why. It might be the arithmetic of the middle that's not committed, or these teeny-weeny new parties and the effect that might have. I don't know. I'm not a polling expert, and Dahlia...
that's Dahlia Shainlin's territory.
Yeah, and she's extremely wise on these things, and I hope she has an answer to it. But it's very fluid.
Yeah, it's not at all guaranteed. I'm curious, if you spoke to people when you were here recently, said anything about this, but in the progressive left-wing liberal world here in Israel, one of the things that people are trying to figure out is whether, in terms of Netanyahu's learning from Trump, if he's going to try let's say he loses.
In fact, one of the prime ministers that I did speak to, who obviously hates Bibi, Ehud Olmert, was one of the first people to bring that up in conversation. The possibility of a kind of January 6th attempt in Israel, should it be necessary, quote unquote.
We know that people learned from Trump. Bolsonaro did his own version in Brazil. I want to ask you about your read on where the politics of Israel and Palestine are going in the United States. You've done a lot of coverage, and the New Yorker's done a lot of coverage about how Israel and its prosecution of the war have become central, if not the central issue, in some of the factional debates within the Democratic Party. Where do you think it's going to go?
Well, it's bad for the moment for Israel. Bad. Rahm Emanuel came to Israel. Obviously, he has political interests in doing so, but he delivered a message that was true. You don't have a PR problem. You have a political problem. You don't have a Zoran Mandani problem, or, pick your, favorite object of suspicion. You have a real problem that the Israeli behavior in the last 3 years in Gaza and now in the West Bank, Bibi's overall behavior with American presidents, full stop, over time, has penetrated. And people ask themselves, why are we so, at a minimum, why should we be unquestioningly supportive of this? And obviously the opposition runs a lot deeper than that. It's not we have a lousy Hasbara campaign. It is rooted in real things. And at the same time, is there anti-Semitism? You bet. Is Tucker Carlson something more than just critical of Israeli policy? You bet. Or Candace Owen, or countless others. Are there more attacks on Jews in the streets? You bet. All that is true too. It goes back to what we were saying about two things being true at the same time. And to be indifferent to that is, to me, unforgivable as well. It's a real powerful element in certain political campaigns. You saw it in Michigan. You saw it just now in Florida. I think the Palestinian question was certainly animating in the life of and career of Zoran Mamdani, although the descriptions I hear of him when I'm in Israel in some quarters, I don't recognize from reality here.
Can you say more about that? I mean, I don't know if you saw recently that the Likud unveiled a political billboard campaign with the enemies of Israel, and the pictures on the billboard are like Nasrallah, Qasem Soleimani, and then Mamdani.
I'm sorry, it's disgusting. I think, Mamdani was that a good idea, to take time to concentrate on Netanyahu's potential visits to New York? No, I don't. Do I think he's an anti-Semite? No, I don't. I think his critique of Israeli policy is thick on the ground and sincere. Look, I'm talking to you on the Haaretz. I've been to Israel, I don't know how many times. I have relatives who live in Jerusalem and elsewhere. I've thought about this place, care about this place for obvious reasons for a very long time. I've written about Russia for all my adult life too. When I write about Russia, the reaction I get, Josh, is basically, that's really interesting. When I write about this, it's almost all bad. Either I'm a self-hating Jew, or I'm an anti-Semite, or what about Sykes-Picot? You're a moron, and.
You're describing my inbox on a daily basis.
I jokingly say I've made a few good decisions in life. One of them was I married the right person, and I didn't sign up for Twitter. I'm not obsessed with the incoming on this social media bullshit, but it reaches me. And it reaches me also as an editor. If I published Mossab Abu Toa and Mohammed Mawish, two Gazan-born Palestinians who left Gaza rather recently and wrote both, in Mohammed's case, reporting, and Mossab, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his essays. And so I was an anti-Semite for publishing them. And then on the other hand, I'll publish something by Ruth Margalit, who's an excellent reporter and thinker, and incidentally, the daughter of somebody I admire very much, Avishai Margalit. And why do you publish in Israel? All of this, the emotional temperature of this was incredibly high before October 7th, and now it's like one of those cartoon thermometers. It's always blowing up.
Since you mentioned that holding two truths, competing, complex, it strikes me from the outside that you've put a lot of thought into how the magazine also manages to model what that looks like. I think that makes your publication, The New Yorker, fairly unique on the media landscape of today. Do you worry that kind of, let's say, that norm of intellectual honesty, of commitment to the complex truth is not going to be around very much longer?
Well, I think a lot of other publications think of themselves as intellectually honest on their own terms. And I think that we benefit in a democracy by a multiplicity of publications and outlooks and editorial approaches. I read the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and I read Jacobin. I read The Atlantic, I read the New York Times, I read small websites. I think anybody who limits himself or herself to one publication, much less one algorithmic stream, you're committing yourself to the self-reward of agreeing with yourself all the time, and you learn nothing and you challenge yourself never. And that's a kind of, it's the opposite. That's the antithesis of, you'll forgive the terrible expression, liberalism and free thought.
You mentioned liberalism, which is suffered a few blows in the last, let's say, the last decade. And we were just talking about Trump recently, and I wanted to ask whether you thought, in some ways, the Trump BB phenomenon is a global one, and Trump is probably not going to be around for very much longer. And I'm curious if you have a sense of, or how you're thinking about the potential contours of a post-Trump world. It strikes me that there, as to use the sort of journalistic cliche, is both a great promise but also great peril, in the sense that you could have, on the one hand, in America, a Tucker Carlson bid for presidency.
I think that's possible. And the more I listen to him, the more I recognize his demagogic skills, which are very different from Trump's. They're smoother. What's striking, Josh, is the margins here, right? Hillary Clinton, had she, campaigned for a few more days in Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera, we might not be having this conversation, or it might have been a conversation delayed down the line. Look at your own election in Israel. The difference between better and disaster.
Exactly. Had Meretz and Labor merged for the 2022 election, then who knows what would have happened.
I'm sitting here in New York City reading a piece on what might happen in Sderot, a city of how many people?
Not that many.
That's why voting is important. That's why good journalism as opposed to shitty journalism is important. And yes, I think it is global, obviously with local characteristics. The failure of liberal democratic states in the late 20th century to cope with meta phenomenon like post-industrialization, deindustrialization, immigration, cultural issues, the failure to get arms around that sufficiently has had these ramifications through the rise of some pretty awful actors who have great similarities. And I came to Israel in the 90s when Bibi was elected the first time. In those days, not only did I have access to him, I had access to his father, and I wrote a long profile.
Yes, it includes some fantastic anecdotes and lines. There are a few that I actually wanted to ask you, particularly the one where you're stuck in a room and Bibi lights a cigar and smokes you out, basically.
For a head of state, a quite small office with the room just filling with, Cuban cigar smoke and his press guy practically choking to death, I think he kind of enjoyed that Machiavellian move. I don't want to have any illusions here, but that was still the Likud that included Dan Meridor and Benny Begin. Some of them were nobody's idea of a left-winger.
These are not doves by any stretch.
But they did believe in the basics of democracy. And people have argued that's the case with Jabotinsky himself. Or, you could certainly argue that his view of democracy did not include all populations. We are a long way from this now. The world in which Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are not decoration, they're not details they are crucial to this coalition, and they're in positions of enormous responsibility and help shape the political imagination, in a perverse way, of Israel and so many Israelis. So that instead of having a Menachem Begin who is capable of finding common ground with Anwar Sadat, it's very much an open question about whether we are in a realm of annexation and ethnic cleansing. That's not some left-wing Harvard professor, of reality or imagination, with an academic, radical view of the world that has no rooting in reality. This is the rhetoric and behavior of real political ministers with real political power. I was having a conversation with an Israeli journalist we both know. And he said, there are times when I think the most important political influence of Israel today is not Ben Gurion, but Meir Kahane. For all my concerns and criticisms of Israel over time, I would not have believed that this malevolent influence from my beloved city of New York would come to have, who was banned from the Knesset, whose party was banned from Israeli politics, would come to exert this kind of influence. It would never occur to me, foolishly, of course, X years ago, that somebody who hung the portrait of Baruch Goldstein on his wall and who really worshipped at the political altar of Meir Kahane would have outsized political influence on the government and on the political temper of a substantial number of constituents.
Controls the police. He's the Minister of National Security.
And by the way, Americans know that. This is not a secret that can be concealed. And so when Israelis get outraged by a change in opinion about Israel, and the only reaction is raising it as a matter of anti-Semitism, that is a fantasy that's is not going to help Israel itself. I fully understand when I listen to somebody I admire, Yossi Klein Halevi, who I have lots of political disagreements about, but very basic ones. And I understand that at once he is anti-Netanyahu, but he's very suspicious of a lot of the criticism of Israel coming from abroad. I think it's important, and I think Yossi understands this, that some of it is in certain quarters rank anti-Semitism. But a lot of it is seriously not. To live in the illusion that it's just all anti-Semitism is injurious above all to an Israeli future, and not incidentally a decent Palestinian future, who also deserve security and safety and justice.
I think what you said is very important. And I hear two voices and two potential responses to that. So I want to start with one, which would say, that's what you're saying about criticism of Israel is 100% true. But I think where I'm sitting and some of the things that have happened over the last few years is that some Israelis, this is, certainly those who are in academia are also responding to this as criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic and doesn't bother, it's what we do. But there is a strain, and I think for someone in, or in my age cohort, it often sounds like the dominant one that says the only just resolution to this is Israel's dismantlement. And I think that because of how loud that is, it puts people maybe who are even really disposed to be on board with with the criticisms of the policies to be on the defensive. It's a dynamic I'll say and find myself in.
I think that's a good point. I think when a magazine article refers to not to Israel or Palestine, but rather the landmass between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, when that kind of game is being played that mirrors maps that we see in certain part of the world where Israel doesn't exist, it mirrors the same sort of temper that one sees in certain quarters in Israel.
Right, it's the mirror image of Ben Gvir, to this fantasy of erasure.
Erasure. I think both are morally intolerable and politically foolish at best. There is no future, certainly no peaceful future, without some form of a resolution. None of those forms can include, in any sane or moral world, expulsion of any kind.
Do you think that the discourse, to use that disgusting and over cliche word, changes if Ben Gvir and Smotrich they're not going to disappear because they'll still be around, but aren't the ugly face of Israel to the world? Yeah, obviously, Avigdor Lieberman probably will be around. It's not going to be John Lennon in the Knesset. It's true that Israel has a reality problem, not an image problem. At the same time, the face that it presents to the world does have an effect on the way that people relate to it.
I live in a country where there was a time where people voted for third parties because they were, quote unquote, there's no difference between George Bush and Al Gore. To me, that's somewhere between outsized frustration and infantile. I understand a level of frustration that can bring people to think there's no difference between X and Y when there is a big difference. At the same time, I think it's possible to say what an Eisenkot victory would bring and what it would not bring, certainly in any immediate sense.
Right. I was talking to an administrator, former administrator at one of Israel's universities, and he said to me, I don't think that it's immoral to stay in Israel now, but I also realize that there might become a point in which it is, which I thought was a very striking thing for someone in his position or having to say.
The politics in this country right now are pretty bad, and they could get worse. Where am I going to leave? And go where exactly? The Israeli thinking about this is different. Most Americans, if I have this right, don't have one passport, much less two. That's a particularly Israeli thing, and I think it would be tragic for Israel. Because if that population leaves in any numbers, and it has in recent years, I think you've lost thousands of doctors, if I recall, and to lose 1,000 doctors in the scale of Israeli population.
Yeah, I mean, the estimated number of departures is around a judicial overhaul is around 100, is more than 150,000.
That's a lot. And I'm guessing that is mostly not Haredim and people on the far right.
No.
So the percentages begin to shift. And the political culture begins to shift, and it's very hard to recover from that.
The second thing he said, this figure said to me was, and if Netanyahu wins, it'll be lights out.
What's lights out
right.
mean? What lights out means, what I think lights out means is you become a more pariah state quality that we're seeing now will only increase. The sense of self-embattlement and rage about that will only increase. politics of the political culture will move more to the right, not more to the left. The impulse of West Bank annexation and equivalent horror in Gaza will only increase. People get infuriated sometimes because they think it's just mushy liberalism to say elections have consequences, but they really do. And sometimes what you see is the erasure of those elections or the undermining of those elections. And I've seen it not just in Russia, I've seen it in my own country. Suddenly, the President of the United States calls into question the result of the election, the veracity of the election, the technology of the election, and that penetrates the political consciousness of the population in huge quarters and weakens people's ties to the state in ways that are immensely damaging. I highly recommend to your listeners who have a spare 3 hours in their day to listen to Joe Rogan's interview with J.D. Vance.
Interesting recommendation.
If you want to get a sense of the American political culture and what its potential to get worse or continue to be horrific in a new way, listen to that podcast and you'll get a sense of J.D. Vance's highly elastic character in the way he sits down with Joe Rogan for 3 hours, in a way that you'd never get on Meet the Press or even a profile in certain highly esteemed weekly magazines. It's fascinating to me because what he does in that phrase that we now all use is try to meet Joe Rogan where he is. So if Joe Rogan is cheerfully talking about, idiotically about flying saucers, that's where he's going to go. That's where J.D. Vance goes. If Joe Rogan has some crackpot theory about what's going on in the political life, Vance finds a way to agree with him. J.D. Vance is this, who's got to be considered the leading contender to succeed Trump, is out to win above all. And he's willing to be elastic about it. Here's a guy who clearly did not want us to go to war with Iran. And according to Maggie Haberman, he said that it was bullshit what Netanyahu was selling in the Situation Room. And now he's selling the war as ardently as anybody. And that's the way he is on almost every issue. Were he to win an election would have a big consequence then. Yeah.
David, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with the Haaretz podcast. We are really grateful.
Well, I appreciate your indulging me. And again, I really consider it an honor to be on with you and with Haaretz, which is an institution that I think is so important. And I hope you all, and I know you will, withstand the criticism and keep doing the great work that you are doing.
Thank you. No, the honor is ours. We really appreciate it. And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz podcast. Thank you to my guest, David Remnick, and to producer and editor, Adi Shacham. If you want to continue to watch or listen to the podcast and make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com.